a number of different capacities. Hank has served the country in uniform in the Air Force and in various positions at the Pentagon, the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. He was the negotiator for President Reagan in what was called the Defense and Space Talks. He then went on to become, for George Herbert Walker Bush, the director of the Missile Defense Agency, which is, of course, the entity that the government created to translate President Reagan's vision of protecting the country against missile attack into a reality. Hank is an extraordinary public servant, as well as a man who has continued to contribute mightily through an organization called High Frontier, which he chairs. It was founded by a Lieutenant General by the name of Danny Graham to translate the Reagan vision, in fact, before it was the Reagan vision, into a reality. And we owe Hank a tremendous debt of gratitude. I'm very pleased to have him as a key member of our coalition, and delighted that JD and Peter, you were able to get him here at least via Skype. So with that, over to you, Hank.
Thank you, Frank. I hope you can hear me now. Can someone wave if that's okay?
Loud and clear.
Okay, good. If there's a problem hearing me, I can see you, so give me a high sign, put a hand behind an ear or something, and I'll try to repeat. I really appreciate you folks wiring me in this way. I'm at Clemson University. I'm a member of the class of 1958, and it's reunion weekend here. So we are reminiscing about old times. It really is getting to be old times for us, but yesteryear in any case. And I'm going to go down that same theme in talking with you about some personal experiences that I have had that lead me to witness that EMP is a very real threat to our nation. We know how to counter it if we have the political will to do so. And that's the fundamental problem. It's not money, it's not technology, it's political will. That's our issue. For the first 20 years of my life, I had hands-on experience working in nuclear weapons effects. First at Bell Laboratories in New Jersey, and then at the Air Force Weapons Laboratory in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and at a number of other organizations after then for the remainder of the 20 years. But in the early 1960s, we discovered on underground nuclear tests that I was associated with, in fact was associated with directly, EMP was more than a nuisance, it was disruptive to our ability to make good measurements, and it sometimes caused damage. In 1962, there was a high-altitude test called Starfish Prime that may have been mentioned already by Peter or whoever has talked before me. And this made it clear to everyone that EMP had long-distance effects. It turned out the lights in Hawaii some 900 miles away, for example. And this was the era of vacuum tube electronics. Had there been solid-state electronics pervasive in Hawaii as there is today, the damage would have been much greater, and quite possibly, maybe even likely, the electric power grid of Hawaii would have been taken down by that particular event. It was a high-yield event, 1.4 megatons, and as I recall, it was, I don't remember, 100 to 200 miles in the above the Earth's atmosphere. You don't need that large a yield. We know this. Peter Fry, if he's spoken to you, I'm sure has mentioned this. There are special designs that can produce the EMP effects. They're tailored to produce EMP effects, gamma rays that interact with the Earth's geomagnetic field and produce the effect. And we know how to do this. The Russians know how to do this, and they pass that information on to the Chinese and the North Koreans, and by way of them to Iran, for example, as well as no doubt other places. So this is not just an issue that we understand, and the effects, as I said, in Hawaii were a novelty to some at that time, sort of like having the northern lights for all of the Hawaiians. Today, it would be catastrophic if we had that kind of an event. We recognize this in other roles that I play, and the effects, the problematic effects, the dangers became highly classified, top secret. During my time at the Air Force Weapons Laboratory, we built simulators to test our strategic systems to these effects, which we hardened and designed measures to counter the EMP effects so that we could assure that our systems could operate through an attack that we fully expected the Soviets to launch as a precursor to a main attack to us. And had they set off nuclear weapons in the above the Earth's atmosphere over the United States prior to our hardening, our critical systems, we would not have been able to retaliate. The President would not have been able to communicate to the commanders of our strategic forces to fight back, and it would have been a disaster. I want to say that a couple of things about this that we can now talk about, and I'll come back to this point. But we took special measures to bypass the normal communication systems and power systems of the civil infrastructure in hardening our strategically important systems. We expected them to fail. We did not believe in the reliability of the basic civil infrastructure. So we had our special communication system. For example, we talked to our submarines with an airplane called TACAMO, take charge and move out. That's what it stands for. And it trailed a long wire behind the back and communicated to our undersea submarines. We tested all of our ICBMs against the effects that we expected they might have to run into if they were launched into an attack that was nuclear and exposed to EMP as well as other effects, X-rays and so on. And we worked very hard to be sure our Minuteman system and our bombers, the B-52 bombers, which, by the way, the grandsons of folks that were flying for the first time in the 1950s are now flying those same airplanes, hardened and tested on an item we call trestle out in Albuquerque, which was entirely made of wood, no nails in it, so that there would be no conductors, and so we could simulate the effects on the operational equipment on the B-52. We tested the President's airplane. We tested the Commander Strategic Air Command's airplane to assure those systems would work. And we built special communication systems to make sure that the commander of SAC, the Strategic Air Command, and the President could talk to each other, rather than depending on long lines, AT&T, which there were efforts to harden, but we did not consider them reliable at the time. I go through this to make a basic point. We understood the problems, we knew how to fix the problems, and on those systems that we thought were truly important, we expended great effort to make sure they worked and could operate through a nuclear attack. But we did little or nothing to harden our civil infrastructure. And that remains the situation today, and that is a fundamental problem, which I presume is the main topic of your discussion here. So my bottom line is that I know that EMP is real, that we tested it. In a period of my life, as I think Frank mentioned, I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Air Force, and I oversaw all these programs that I'm talking about, at least for the Air Force systems and for the communication systems, which the Air Force was responsible for providing. And we worked very hard to deal with these issues. Bill Graham is a name I want to bring to your attention if he hasn't been mentioned already. Dr. Graham was a colleague of mine at the Air Force Weapons Laboratory in the 1960s. He was associated with the Starfish Prime experiment that I was telling you about, and has been associated with understanding EMP and designing our systems to deal with it ever since. He was chosen, he rose to be President Reagan's science advisor, and he was chosen to lead the EMP Commission chartered by the Congress to deal with these issues, and they issued a 2004 report, their first report. The only thing unclassified in that report was the executive summary, which gave the right bottom lines. But it took another 4 years to get the material, much of the material that had been classified, some of it at the most sensitive levels, to an open source so that everyone can have access to it. And that came out in 2008. You can find these reports, among other places, on our webpage at High Frontier, www.highfrontier.org. If you go to it and look down the right column, you'll see where you can just click on it and bring those reports up. The second one I mentioned is quite extensive. I don't remember, it's somewhere between 250, 300 pages, and it lays out most all of the information that engineers need to understand the EMP problem and to deal with it. There are authoritative conclusions that came out. This was only 6 years ago that everything became public, but beginning 2004, Bill, I believe, testified before Congress, and there was a closed session of Congress to hear their conclusions initially, and among the other things he said, I believe, was that if one of these events took place, the resulting societal collapse, the chaos that would result without the conveniences that we all take for granted, could lead to the death of somewhere between 2/3 and 90% of all Americans over a year's period, just from the chaos, the breakdown. So I would say that we still have this problem where most Americans are largely uninformed because the substance of what I've just told you was highly classified at one period, and even those who were knowledgeable about it could not share a great deal of information. That is no longer true. There is no excuse for our leaders, congressional and executive branch leaders in this regard, but the American people, I believe, are largely ignorant of this. And I think a main challenge for those of us who are in the know and can still do it is to inform the public and try to empower the local and state authorities to take initiative and raise the heat on Washington. As someone said, maybe they'll see the light when they feel the heat from home. So that's the main thing I'm after in trying to get across to you. This is an important Congress in this regard. The next point I want to make is that, as Frank mentioned, I led the SDI program, which focused during my period, actually before my period, on the threat of Soviet attack and how to defend against it. That threat came from over the North Pole, or the main threat that we were worried about. And so the defenses that we designed were directed toward ICBMs, long-range ballistic missiles, attacking us from the north. They would come over the North Pole. So we have a site in Alaska largely associated with this expectation with respect to the threat from North Korea, for example, and Iran, for that matter. That's still the focus. There's another problem that is largely ignored, and that is that with ships that patrol or go near our coast, even commercial vessels, you can carry on board short and medium-range missiles that can be launched off those ships. We did this with a Minuteman in the 1960s. In fact, we dropped a Minuteman even out of an airplane, and launched it. So having different ways to launch ballistic missiles is not a novelty. The Iranians have tested this way out of the Caspian Sea. And anyway, a missile, short-range missile, can be launched off our coast to set off its weapon above the United States and create the effects of concern. They, of course, also could set them off in cities. But in either case, we are ill-prepared to deal with this problem. Even though our Aegis ships, which patrol both the east and west coast, patrol is the wrong word, they're there. On any given day last year, taken at random, somewhere between 4 and 6 Aegis ships were on the East Coast. If those crews were trained and they were BMD ships, ballistic missile defense ships, they could shoot down missiles that were launched from vessels off our coast. To my knowledge, we don't train to do this, we don't exercise to do this, we don't demonstrate to do this. All of our testing is done in the Pacific Test Range out of Hawaii or out of Vandenberg Air Force Base toward the launch sites in Kwajalein in the South Pacific. We should be doing the same kind of tests off of our East Coast, the same way we test our submarine-launched ballistic missiles out of, off of our East Coast. So there's no reason why we can't do this, no reason why we can't empower the ships on the East Coast to defend against this nature of the threat. It's just that we haven't done it. That only takes care of a piece of the problem, though. Our Aegis ships do not go into the Gulf of Mexico. And so we're vulnerable, we have a soft underbelly to threats from the Gulf of Mexico or, for example, from Venezuela, with whom Iran cooperates on threatening measures. So this is a serious problem. And it's not hypothetical, though some of you may recall that last June, I believe it was, the Panamanians stopped a vessel, North Korean vessel, searched it and found two SA-2s, the surface-to-air missiles that were designed to carry nuclear weapons. Hopefully they were not on board, but their launchers were being carried, intended to be carried through the Panama Canal, or had been, I don't remember the details. But we found them down south. If they had a nuclear weapon on board and had escaped discovery, they, in fact, last year could have launched the kind of attack we're concerned about. So the means of this kind of attack are not just hypothetical, they're quite real. North Korea and Iran both launched satellites. And you may or may not be aware, they set up to launch them to the south. Perhaps just to be over the water so that if there is a problem, it falls in the water. But a byproduct of the way they approach the problem is that those satellites come over the United States from the south. They'll come over the South Pole and approach the United States from the south. It's no big deal to put a nuclear weapon on board a satellite. In fact, it's easier to design that mode of attack than it is an ICBM or even a shorter range ballistic missile where the nuclear weapon must re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. It's just a simpler design. They set it off 150 miles over the central part of the United States and create the EMP effect that is of great concern. Now, both North Korea and Iran have launched satellites that are capable of carrying the lighter nuclear weapons that I mentioned earlier. The lower weight and specially designed EMP weapons. So this, again, is not necessarily a hypothetical threat. In fact, the Russians developed this capability in the 1960s. It was called a fractional orbital bombardment system. And they tested it. And through arms control measures, presumably they agreed never to employ it that way. But again, this is not a new development. It is an existing capability, inherent existing capability. And what you're primarily after is just carrying a nuclear weapon and detonating it over the United States. We're unprepared to deal with this. Again, we could deal with it in a very straightforward way. For example, in the case of North Korea, if we deployed the radars that are normally deployed with our Theater High Altitude Area Defense, the so-called THAAD system, in the Philippines, that could give sufficient information for our Aegis ships at sea to shoot down satellites at least at some altitudes, and those ships are there. We've got, 6 or 8 ships in the vicinity of North Korea, even now in the Pacific. And that's all we need in order to enable them. And that same radar can be interneted with our communication systems and employed along with our ground-based system at Vandenberg Air Force Base in California to shoot down such a satellite that comes over the South Pole toward the United States before it arrives. So these are issues that can be dealt with. It's not expensive, by the way. We've got 10 or so, they're called TIPI-2 radars of the sort I mentioned. We're deploying them in other places already. No reason why we couldn't deploy them in the Philippines if we had the appropriate agreement.
Ambassador Cooper?
You know, Iran, but still
Ambassador?
won't go into that at this moment.
Ambassador Cooper?
I believe this is evidence enough that our problem, again, is not technology, it is not money, because the systems that are already could provide the defense I'm speaking of.
Ambassador Cooper?
Yes?
Your group here in Indianapolis, I want to tell you that we have a lot of people from different sectors who all touch this issue. And we really, really appreciate your national/global perspective as far as you're taking it. Because we are going to, from here on, really look at a state perspective. And you've just given us a great, great foundation for that. And we just really, really wanted to appreciate your comments and say thank you very, very much for joining us today. I think you know we've got Peter Pry here, Cindy Ayers, and Frank Gaffney, and we'll be joining Kurt Weldon later on. So you can tell we've got a great selection of presenters to really bring us up to speed. And with the people in this room, I believe Indiana's going to move to the head of the class as far as doing something from an Indiana perspective. So we're going to say thank you to you right now, and you all, you just keep looking for Indiana on this issue, because I think you're going to see us moving and a grooving. All
Well,
right?
I'm very pleased to hear that. That was the last thing I was going to say. I think the whole country depends on folks like you taking this issue to heart and dealing with it from the bottom up, because Washington is seriously broken on the issue.
Well, I
Thank
think
you
you'll
very
hear
much
more
for
about
having me.
Indiana on your Wednesday phone calls. So we appreciate it greatly, sir. Thank you for joining us, and you keep watching for Indiana. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.